Hello, welcome to the Caribbean Studies Network in Oxford. My name is David Howard. I'm an Associate Professor in Sustainable Urban Development here at the university. I'm delighted to chair today's discussion of four excellent speakers to discuss the legacies and impact of COVID-19 in the Caribbean. So I'm delighted to have Stacian Robinson with me today, Kevon Rhiney, Adele Thomas, and Yonique Campbell. And they'll be giving their 10-minute pithy pitches about their perceptions of post-COVID or mid-COVID life in the Caribbean, looking at the economic, environmental, political and social implications of the pandemic and looking ahead to future strategies. So that's enough about the setup. We'll move straight into the show. We'll be delighted to answer your questions. So the audience, if you can write your questions in the Q&A, we'll have the four presentations first, and then I'll relay the questions to the speakers. So do type away your questions as we're going through. And we'll be speaking for an hour. We'll finish on the hour. So looking forward to the discussion ahead. So the first speaker, it's a great pleasure to introduce Stacian Robinson. Stacy-ann is an assistant professor of environmental studies at Colby College in Maine. Her research and interests look at the human, social and political dimensions of climate change, particularly in small island developing states, and particularly she has a specialism in adaptive finance, or adaptation finance. So Stacy-ann, over to you.
Thank you, David, for the introduction. I'm now off mute, so I'm hoping that everybody's able to see my screen. I'll be talking very briefly this morning about post-COVID-19 recovery in the Caribbean. From my perspective, there are many frames through which you can understand, examine, look at post-COVID-19 recovery in the Caribbean. I'm thinking here that you could look at it through the lens of adaptive capacity or vulnerability or resilience or transformation or some other frame. So this morning, I want to focus my attention on adaptive capacity, which based on the fifth assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change refers to the ability of systems, institutions, humans, and other organisms to adjust to potential damage, to take advantage of opportunities, or to respond to consequences. So my general approach this morning is that I will have three propositions and I will support them with evidence from my research using this frame of adaptive capacity. So my first proposition is that COVID-19 is just but one of many threats to the ability of institutions in the Caribbean to adjust and respond to consequences. From my perspective, it is merely masking or detracting from underlying challenges to the achievement of sustainable development in the region. So the evidence from my research suggests that policymakers in the Caribbean region agree that countries face a myriad of threats that impede the achievement of sustainable development. And here I'm drawing on my article that was published in Island Studies Journal 2 years ago, entitled Adapting to Climate Change at the National Level in Caribbean Small Island Developing States. I'll take just two brief extracts from the interviews that I conducted as part of that research. So one interviewee shared that the national security policy in Jamaica identified 90 threats. The impact of crime in Jamaica is 15 times higher than that of earthquakes or other natural hazards. The cost of crime is 7.5% of the country's GDP. A hurricane costs the country 2% of GDP every couple years or so, but the high probability, high impact events are crime and corruption. These do more harm than any other threat. I'll move on to my second proposition, and this is that financing is a significant limit to policy action in the Caribbean. There will be no sustainable recovery in the region, whether post-hurricanes or post-COVID-19, until access to financing streams is increased and external debt is reduced. Based on the evidence from my research, I see that national communications submitted by Caribbean countries to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change suggests that the top 3 limits, and here it's very specific to climate adaptation, but with broader implications for any kind of recovery in the region, are financing as number 1, technical capacity and resources as number 2, and data and records as number 3. And here I'm drawing from my book chapter entitled Climate Change Adaptation Limits in Small Island Developing States, which I published in 2018. Now, looking more specifically at the reported adaptation limits in the Caribbean, as I mentioned before, the top 3 are finance, technical capacity, and data and records. But from this list, and you can have a look at some of the other limits that were mentioned, there are many emerging issues. One of them is concessional financing. Now, depending on the classification of the countries, whether they're low income, middle income, or high income countries, this limits their access to grant financing for recovery operations. And in the region, there are 5 high income economies, including Antigua and Barbuda and St. Kitts and Nevis. But based on this classification, countries have to take out loans, for example, to finance recovery operations. Now, in the context of COVID-19, some of the other emerging issues based on what we can draw from adaptation financing limits, we're looking at the cost of care, the cost of vaccines, the accessibility or the ability of countries to actually conduct contact tracing. We're seeing intersections between the implications of a reliance on tourism or a reliance on informal sectors on the economic ability of the region to recover, and of course, questions relating to economic diversification. Now I'll move on to my third and final proposition. And here I want to focus on resilience and transformation, because within any discourse of COVID-19 recovery, almost inevitably, these 2 terms emerge. Now, I will argue that yes, they're important, but depending on the definitions that you're using or the practical applications, some vulnerable groups are likely to be left behind. So in theory, these terms are quite inclusive, but in practice, they can have exclusionary outcomes. So from my research, what I'm seeing is that resilience and transformation are actually top-down, donor-driven concepts, and there's no uniform understanding of them among actors in the Caribbean. But actors within the region commonly define resilience as the ability to bounce back from extreme events. And here you can very much think of COVID-19 as an extreme event. And these actors also note that transformation requires the disruption of current socioeconomic and political systems. Now, this proposition is based on my article that I also published in 2018 entitled Knowledge, Attitudes, and Practices of Climate Adaptation Actors Towards Resilience and Transformation in a 1.5 degrees Celsius World. Now I'll just draw on a few extracts out, just sharing what interviewees had to say about resilience. One interviewee shared that resilience takes attention away from those who are unable to change or bounce back, and prioritizes those who can adapt and bounce back, such that if they aren't able to adapt, then you aren't worth the attention. Another interviewee shared that resilience is important to maintain normalcy because it feeds into an element of predictability, which allows you to plan and organize properly with a higher level of certainty. However, being in an unpredictable environment, which is the environment in which we find ourselves at the moment, makes the probability of achieving goals and objectives that much harder. as the risk of failure is higher, which is not an environment in which individuals can thrive. Now, turning our attention to transformation in the context of that research, interviewees shared that transformation is the how and resilience is the why. Transformation is how you're going to get there, and resilience is why you want to get there. Another interviewee shared that you need one to achieve the other. You need transformation if you're going to be resilient to climate change, and I'll add, if you're going to be resilient to some of the impacts of COVID-19 in the region. Another interviewee shared that transformation is a part of the process to get to resilience. Resilience is actually the outcome. And finally, transformation is needed to achieve resilience, but by being resilient, does not necessarily mean that you've been transformative. So what are some of the considerations going forward? I will argue that there's a need for interaction and integration of science and policy at the decision-making levels in the Caribbean so that leaders can have a greater sense, a greater investment in the decisions that they're making. And again, this was shared by an interviewee. Another thing that I'd like to mention is that research tends to be confined to some of the larger islands in the region that have good data management. So we want to see more research that's emerging out of some of the smaller islands in the Eastern Caribbean. And finally, knowledge sharing and learning needs to be improved across the region. We need to start investing more heavily in evidence-based decision-making. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you much indeed, Stacian. So you've launched us with your 3 propositions around crime, and impacts of crime, finance, and thoughts around resilience and transformation. It's a pleasure now to welcome Kevon Rhiney, an assistant professor in the geography department at Rutgers University. Kevon's interests focus around climate change, agrarian change, and critical development studies. So I think you're in Jersey today, but you're going to be talking about your recent experiences in Kingston. Kevon, over to you.
Thanks, David. And thanks for the members of the Oxford Research Centre in the Humanities for organizing this very timely seminar. What I'm going to be doing today in my time that's been allocated to me is just to kind of reflect on some key themes emerging from this, what I call pandemic moment. Despite the title of this seminar, the Caribbean is certainly still in the midst of COVID-19, and I fear the impacts will be felt for some time. And it will take some time for us to fully understand the lessons to be learned and the legacies from it. And despite the significant medical breakthroughs that we've seen in vaccine development, it will take some time for the rollout of a global vaccination program. And I fear many countries in the global south, particularly countries in the Caribbean, will probably not be among some of the first countries to gain access to these vaccines. So the impacts of COVID will likely last for some time. And even though I think the current moment requires us to step back a bit and to kind of see what COVID-19 has revealed. For sure, we've seen the spread of COVID-19 through an interconnected world, particularly in the first few months of 2020. And it is probably one of the best examples of a problem that is global in scope. The failure of a global public good, and in this case, the global public health system, following the outbreak of this novel disease became very apparent. It has translated into devastating health, economic, and societal impacts across the globe. Yet, what is clear is that COVID-19 health outcomes cannot simply be correlated to national incomes or kind of traditional ways of ranking different countries like the North-South divide, right? As we've seen, some of the highest infection and fatality rates recorded to date have been in countries like the United States and countries in Western Europe. And in contrast, the picture seems quite mixed for the global South. So for the most part, the Caribbean has fared well in terms of COVID-19 infections and fatalities. And that requires us to ask some really solid questions. How do we make sense of this? And what does this mean for the Caribbean going forward? And to some extent, I think that the answer is pretty straightforward, right? COVID-19 has simply revealed, particularly in the US context, pre-existing challenges of inequality and deprivation, right? So social determinants of health, which are traditionally poverty and axes of differences regarding race and ethnicity, immigration status, have all shaped COVID-19 health outcomes. Also, given the economic fallout triggered by the public health safety measures, larger economies would register some of the highest impacts. This is seen in the hundreds of millions of people who have lost their jobs and livelihoods, particularly in the service sector. But I argued in today that the economic impacts in the Caribbean are probably less visible due to the high prevalence of informal sector jobs, and therefore the inability of the state to accurately measure COVID-19 impacts. And I'll use the rest of my talk to kind of reflect on at least 3 ways in which I see COVID-19 impacting the Caribbean, drawing on my own experience in Jamaica, and then using those 3 examples to kind of think about what does this mean for the future of the Caribbean. The first thing I want to focus on is the digitization of global economies, and what does this mean in the context of the Caribbean. So what we've seen in the Caribbean is certainly a widening in the digital divide. While we've seen an acceleration of digitization globally, we have seen a marked difference, particularly in Jamaica, where I've seen the closure of public schools that meant that many students were unable to access learning resources. Students who were from lower income families who didn't have access to mobile phones or other types of technologies were pretty much left behind. Many students many kids were left at their homes with very, very limited access to existing resources that were made available in these kind of digital platforms, compared to private schools who seem to have fared better with the transition to online classes. So one of the things that I think COVID-19 has revealed, particularly for the Caribbean, is the need to expand on the digital platform. And I think while there's some work that has already been started, there seems to be a serious and an urgent need to focus on building out the digital platform in the Caribbean. And it's also kind of a major sort of justice issue as well, in terms of who has access to the digital world, and how that sort of maps onto underlying socioeconomic inequalities. The other theme that I want to focus on is food security. So the disruption of markets and global value chains have had a significant impact on Jamaica's agricultural sector. We've seen with the decline in visitor numbers from our tourism industry since March, how that has impacted farming communities across the island. It has led to reduced income for many farmers across Jamaica. And I'm pretty sure this is similar across the rest of the region as well. And elsewhere, I've written where I think COVID-19 will kind of map onto and heighten other forms of inequality. So particularly in terms of farmers' inability to invest in their farms, what you might find over time is that the conditions might start to favor the emergence of other forms of diseases, particularly crop diseases, as you start to see a decline in crop care. And particularly in the tourism, in the coffee industry, we've seen the potential re-emergence of, for instance, a coffee rust epidemic, which emerged in the years from right after the global recession, and has pretty much continued to impact many of the kind of coffee farms across the island, largely because farmers were unable to invest in their farms because of reductions in farm gate prices. And you're seeing that happening again with COVID. On the other side of the coin, we've seen also where COVID has kind of shown the importance of having a strong local agricultural sector. So during the lockdown that took place in Jamaica in the months of March through to June, many communities across the Kingston metropolitan area were able to access foods through the setting up of local farmers markets, which likely increased domestic consumption of locally grown foods in a significant way. So that's another way in which we've seen COVID-19 kind of revealing some of the shortcomings in terms of our food security policies. And lastly, I think COVID-19 has forced us to rethink the kind of reliance that we have on tourism in Jamaica. And I think that might also be something that would be quite relevant for other Caribbean islands as well. I mean, tourism was one of the most hardest hit sectors under this COVID-19 pandemic crisis. And it reveals just how fickle the current model that we're using to promote tourism is. And one of the things that I probably want to talk about or think through later on is kind of, what kind of economic model is required to build resilience, equitable resilience going forward, that isn't as dependent on export-led strategies. And so we've seen that with tourism, we've seen that with our reliance on high-value commodity chains like coffee. I would say that one of the things that COVID has done is really reveal some of the weaknesses in our economic policies across the region. And I'll stop there for now, and I hope to kind of pick up on some of these themes in our Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much indeed, Kevon. So Kevon there raised the concerns over inequalities, particularly around three issues of the digital economy, agrarian economy, food securities, and around the impact on the tourism industry across the Caribbean, really. Thank you very much indeed. Please do send in your questions. We have a great question from Dylan Kerrigan, who will ask that question after the four presentations. And Dylan's interested in impact of vulnerabilities and social cohesion. And our next speaker, Adele Thomas, is a senior research associate at Climate Analytics. And Adele's interests do relate to social vulnerability, adaptation strategies, and the impacts of loss and damage. So Adele, it's a pleasure to have you join us on screen today, and over to you.
Thank you, and thank you for putting on this very important webinar. So my research interests and also my work as a practitioner and a government advisor in the Caribbean are very much focused on climate action at the national and regional scales, and also in providing governments support in dealing with international processes such as the UNFCCC, which is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And so messaging from both the UNFCCC and the IPCC show that we are really at a critical point in the global response to climate change. So from the IPCC's special report on 1.5 degrees, which you may be familiar with, we know that we have a very limited time to implement widespread and unprecedented mitigation and adaptation in order to reduce the risks of climate change. And from the UNFCCC, 2020 was supposed to be this year of countries increasing their ambition to reduce global warming and to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. So COVID really came along at a key point in the global response to climate change, and how countries respond to COVID, how they recover from COVID, will have significant implications for levels of global warming that we can expect in the future, and for how prepared we are to deal with the impacts of climate change. And so my outlook on what the key challenges are for the Caribbean post-COVID are focused on how the responses to COVID in the region can increase or decrease vulnerability to climate change. So we know that Caribbean countries face similar climate hazards, hurricanes, sea level rise, but the risks of climate change are, of course, affected by different vulnerabilities and different abilities to adapt. And before COVID, we saw diversity in the region in terms of level of adaptation and in terms of governance approaches to climate change. So on one hand, we have some countries such as Jamaica, St. Lucia, Belize, that have been very active in climate adaptation. They have climate change ministries or departments, national adaptation plans. They have been implementing adaptation measures. They've been active in the international negotiations, and they've started the process of mainstreaming climate change across development planning. On the other hand, we have countries such as the Bahamas, which have been much less active, really at nascent stages of considering climate change, very few, if any, policies, and very limited linking of climate change with development. And I'd just like to thank Dr. Robinson for her recent article, where she actually ranked the adaptive actions of all SIDS and allowed for comparison between how countries are addressing climate change. And it's really helpful to have that quantitative ranking that supports some of the on-the-ground observations of different levels of engagement by different countries with climate change in the region. And so in my opinion, the different levels of engagement with climate change by countries in the Caribbean that were present before COVID are very much having an effect on how climate change is being included or not included in COVID responses. And that in turn has long-term effects on future climate change risks, which are strongly linked to development for the region. So countries that have already been active in climate change have institutional frameworks that are already set up. Some of them may not be perfect, but they exist. And those frameworks are able to champion climate change and ensure that climate change risks are included as part of the COVID response. They are able to continue with climate actions that may have been planned before the pandemic. So for example, as I mentioned earlier, this was to be the year of increased ambition by countries to the UNFCCC. And we saw that Jamaica was the first country in the region to actually submit its new nationally determined contribution. We've seen submissions to the Green Climate Fund from some of these countries that have been more active to access climate financing. And I think that these countries that already have these institutional frameworks and have been active are also best positioned to take advantage of any benefits for bilateral aid devoted to the COVID response or to climate change. And that will help to ensure that climate change is ingrained in the COVID response. But on the other hand, countries that have not been particularly active and do not have these institutional frameworks set up are less likely to include climate change in their COVID responses and may actually end up with responses that lock them into development pathways that increase their vulnerability to climate change in the long term. And I think this is particularly important because we've seen many countries in the region are taking out loans and increasing their debt. And if these loans are not used in a way that reduces climate vulnerability, then we can actually end up in a situation in the years to come where countries have high levels of debt, they're ill-equipped to address climate risks, and then they have to deal with climate impacts that are quite costly on top of all of that. So for example, the IDB, the Inter-American Development Bank, has recently recommended that Caribbean countries invest in development of infrastructure to boost economic recovery post-COVID. So they're recommending building roads, airports, water, and power infrastructure. I think countries that have climate change plans and policies are more likely to include these risks as factors in determining what infrastructure should be developed, where it should be located, how such infrastructure can be used to reduce climate risk. Countries that are not advanced in engaging with climate change may be less likely to think about these issues when they are developing those infrastructural projects and may invest resources in infrastructure that is vulnerable to climate risk. And so just to flesh out my concerns a bit more, I'll use the example of the Bahamas, where I am actually quite concerned about the exclusion of climate change in the COVID response. So here in the Bahamas, we are an example of the compounding risks of climate change and COVID. We had Hurricane Dorian at the latter part of 2019. We suffered over $3 billion in loss and damage. We took on significant debt to recover from that storm. Our tourism industry was affected. And so we were already in a very vulnerable social and economic state when the COVID pandemic occurred. And the pandemic really underscored all of the countries, all of the factors that make the country vulnerable to climate change. We're one of the most dependent in the region on tourism. It accounts for over 50% of our GDP. We're quite food insecure. More than 80% of our food is imported. We have very high levels of inequality. We have little economic diversification. In addition to that, we have very little engagement with climate change. It's not mainstreamed across development planning, and it's not a consideration for new development. And there are also quite low levels of public awareness of climate risk. And so our COVID response has unfortunately not included a strategic approach to climate change, no focus on reducing vulnerability to climate change. So we're taking on loans to develop infrastructure in areas where there are high climate risks. We are returning to the reliance on cruise ships and mass tourism. The government is also even moving forward with plans to drill for oil, stating that this is a much needed income source. And this lack of including climate change into COVID recovery plans, I think, is setting up the country to be saddled with high levels of debt and also high levels of climate vulnerability. So when the next Hurricane Dorian comes along, we will be in a worse position to recover. When infrastructure such as the several airports that they are proposing have been developed and those are eroded by sea levels, we will still have that debt. And so to wrap up, I think that the different approaches to the COVID response will shape vulnerability to climate change in the decades to come. Countries that use the COVID response to reduce climate vulnerability, and that includes addressing inequalities such as those that Kevon has highlighted, will be in a much better position to address climate impacts as they increase. Whereas countries that continue with a business as usual approach and don't use this as an opportunity to address vulnerability will have to deal with increasingly dire climate impacts. So I think this is a real turning point for the Caribbean, and we're going to see the implications of different recovery strategies in the years to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Adele. Thanks also for your case study, if you will, of Bahamas, but also considering the integration or lack of integration of climate action into any COVID response. So thanks very much indeed. Our fourth speaker is Yonique Campbell, who is a lecturer in the Department of Government at University of West Indies Mona campus. Yonique is specialized in public policy, citizenship rights, security and governance of risk, and has recently written and published a book. And Yonique's going to discuss her views and opinions on post-COVID Caribbean. Yonique, over to you, and pleasure to have you on screen.
Thank you very much, David. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I am very happy indeed to be joining this panel in exploring what I believe to be a very significant problem. And given its significance, John Connell from the University of Sydney, and I have actually been working on a book which looks at COVID-19 in the Caribbean and the Pacific, and we're expecting the book to be published in January. So I'm really delighted to be here, and I really want to thank the organizers for planning this event. I'll spend the next 9 minutes or so talking about two aspects of the problem, and the previous speakers have really touched on some of these issues. I'm going to be talking about the social impacts and the ways in which COVID-19 has amplified certain disparities and inequalities. And I also just want to touch on what I see as important responses from different groups in the Caribbean, and I'll speak about Jamaica a bit more. That's the context I'm most familiar with. So I'm really interested in questions around what kinds of citizens can cope and adapt to the new normal brought by COVID-19, and what kinds of citizens simply can't cope because of their social realities. I would like to suggest perhaps that the Caribbean has really, and the crisis has really revealed certain structural weaknesses in the Caribbean, and certainly certain class tensions as well, and the tension between state and certain kinds of citizens as well. And I think in some ways as well, it has revealed that not all citizens have the privilege perhaps to not have to choose between their economic well-being and their health. So by way of context, and some of the panelists have already touched on this, the Caribbean is particularly vulnerable because of a number of factors. There's a heavy reliance on tourism, and for some islands, 34 to 48% by some estimates of GDP comes from tourism. And this is one of the main areas affected thus far. And I believe the social fallout resulting from this has been quite staggering right across the Caribbean. Importantly as well, there's certainly, in the context of small island developing states, issues around capacity, technical capacity, financial capacity, and therefore constraints, really important or significant constraints in responding to crises. The Caribbean is no stranger to crises, but I believe because of these limitations, then certainly there are many challenges associated with the response. There is, of course, in a lot of the Caribbean countries, limited ICU facilities, testing capacity, shortages of doctors and nurses, hospital beds, and so on. If you look at the expenditure in the healthcare services as well, I think it also brings to the fore some of the limitations, again, from a financial and a technical standpoint. I believe most countries in the Caribbean spend way below the recommended 6% of GDP on health care. So I think that provides an important context. I believe it's also important, however, to point out that the Caribbean is not anywhere as bad as what we are seeing in some of the advanced Western countries. And it raises questions about why, despite limited capacity and so on, why we've actually not done badly. Certainly, if you look at the mortality rates and so on, but that is only one side of the story. I believe the sorts of more invisible impacts, I think on a daily basis, we tend to see the statistics and so on. So certainly from that point of view, I think we've not done badly, but nonetheless, I think the social and economic impacts are actually quite great. And to that extent, I believe a part of the reason the Caribbean has done so well initially in managing the pandemic is because of this realization that there are great risks to small island developing states. And so they simply do not have the luxury to drag their feet in terms of the response. And so I think the management of the virus reflected certainly initially an acceptance that there are those weaknesses, and citizens as well, because of this realization and also the lack of information about the virus, appeared to be quite vigilant in their demands that the government take extreme measures, again, because of this realization and this fear brought about by the realization that we have a kind of limited capacity to respond. And so initially we saw, because of this vigilance, governments in the Caribbean effectively locking out citizens who for one reason or another were outside of the borders. And there was a raging public debate around whether that was the correct action to be taken by the government. And in large measure, citizens were supportive, and this happened in Jamaica, it happened in Trinidad and Tobago, for example. So as I mentioned earlier, COVID-19 has really magnified the social inequalities in the Caribbean. They were always there, but I think the crisis has really brought it to the fore in a very convincing way. And so while some citizens have been able to cope, those who exist, especially in the informal economy, have really suffered quite a bit. And so we really see that the responses to the pandemic in the Caribbean have really had a disproportional impact. And you might ask, what have been the responses in the Caribbean producing this disproportional impact? And the response, I think, is fairly similar to what a lot of other countries really did. The focus was really on lockdowns, individual and community quarantines. So there's a quarantining of entire communities, curfew measures, stay-at-home orders, work from home policies, social distancing, and so on. Now, these measures obviously took on a kind of greater intensity at the beginning. And while the government saw these measures as being absolutely necessary, citizens existing in garrison communities in the context of Jamaica, those existing on the margins, and people living in these spaces really had a different view of the ways in which the measures were actually impacting a large segment of people who work in the informal economy. So most people from the spaces that were quarantined were actually people existing in the informal economy. And so people really complained as well. And I've carried out some studies because I'm also interested in the ways in which some citizens have actually showed greater willingness to comply to COVID-19 measures, while other citizens have rejected the measures being implemented by the state. And to that extent, I went and I did some interviews among religious groups, among political groups, because in Jamaica there was also an election. And so I wanted to talk to people who participated in the political campaign. I also did some interviews among the urban poor, and so on. And it really revealed some very interesting views about the state, people's trust in the state, and people's views about the measures implemented by the government and the impacts really of those measures. And people complained about their inability to, even at a basic level, practice social distancing, to afford basic masks, and to comply to COVID-19 rules more generally. Unable to cope with the measures, people in these spaces have argued that the state is really seeking to use COVID-19 measures to oppress those in the lower stratum. And there's a video being circulated with Buju Banton, who is a very famous Jamaican reggae artist, who I subsequently also interviewed. And he really had or was of the view that the government was using the COVID-19 protocols to oppress the poorer class in the society, and that the government had not done enough to actually mitigate or alleviate the conditions and the social realities in those spaces. And so it really brought to the fore, I think COVID-19 has really brought to the fore the unresolved social tensions in Jamaica amongst different groups, and really revealed the ways in which people lack faith in the state to really take care of their well-being. and to really show that they are aware and concerned and are really taking a more nuanced approach that reflect the social realities of different groups in the society, as opposed to a kind of one size fits all approach. And some citizens expressed the view as well that in the lower stratum that really social distancing and lockdowns and work from home orders were really for the rich. And then it raises the issue, in my view, of the question of whether we're all in this together, because there's a narrative, and I think the state had tried to capitalize on that COVID-19 presented a moment for collective reflection, that we're all affected, no matter your class or your income, but the impacts, of course. So there's that state narrative, and there's a narrative coming from the communities, really saying that we're not all in this together, because the ability to cope and to respond is really mediated by issues around class and income and so on, and so on, and issues to do with high density housing. And I would argue that government policies have not really adequately considered the living conditions, issues of high density housing, for instance, in some of the urban spaces in the Caribbean. So quite a bit of social frustration coming out of certain spaces. And I think the response in the communities that were quarantined were really interesting and revealed quite a bit in terms of the fear of people coming from the restriction of movement, because with the entire communities being quarantined, I think usually the quarantine lasts for about 2 weeks, and people working in the informal economy pretty much lost their jobs. They didn't have the option of being quarantined and working from home. So that kind of restriction.
Yonique, you've gone to mute. Oh.
There, I think I'll just briefly touch on this issue of gender and domestic abuse. And there have been concerns about an increase again in domestic violence. And so again, quarantine and stay-at-home orders have really been challenging for women who suffer intimate partner violence. And so you're seeing that gender dynamic as well. And in a country like Guyana, for instance, 80% of women killed in Guyana were murdered by intimate partners, or really related to a family-related homicide. So stay-at-home orders have really had some devastating impact on women as well. And just very briefly, I would say that in terms of the state response, I think it's obvious that the state needs to take, I believe, a more nuanced approach. The state is now more familiar with the pandemic, and so I believe a more nuanced approach in ensuring that some citizens are not left behind. So I think vulnerable groups, I think they need to be centralized more. I think there's also the question of how to build a more resilient healthcare sector. I think there's an opportunity there to give greater focus again to the disparities in the healthcare sector in Jamaica, and to look more closely at universal access, and to also tackle the issue of non-communicable disease. And again, that affects people more or less in the lower stratum, and studies have really shown that they've been more vulnerable in the COVID-19 pandemic. There is also naturally the question of how to get more people brought into the formal economy as well, and really how to take a more inclusive approach to responding to crises. How do you get more citizens to participate in terms of even the policy response, so that we're not just getting a response from the state and those at the top who are able to really influence state policy. And I think that is reflected in the groups, the tourism sector. I mean, you had groups who were able to really mobilize in a way that you really don't see communities being able to do to represent their concerns and so on. If we're mid-COVID as well, I think there are concerns about access to vaccines, and I think the previous speakers already spoke to that issue. So I believe perhaps I can leave it there, but I think there's a question for the Caribbean about a new normal and how the Caribbean will actually adapt going forward. Will they go it alone, or will the regional mechanisms be strengthened really to deal with the issue? So I think there's really a vast number of issues that the Caribbean must contend with. There's a tourism question as well, and that heavy reliance on tourism. So I think I leave it there, and then we can talk about some of the other issues I perhaps have to talk about further in the Q&A.
Thank you very much indeed, Yonique. That's great. Thank you. Thank you for introducing, I guess, aspects of citizenship and governance and the individual and collective responses to the midst or post-COVID scenario. Great. Can I invite our other three speakers back to the screen? We have some questions coming in. So I think the questions are to all speakers. Yeah, it would be great to hear your responses. So Dylan Kerrigan has raised a question about which many of you covered, but particularly Yonique in your last presentation. Then he's raised this issue about identity politics and how elements of division and social conflict, if you will, around various forms of identity, whether it's ethnicity, class, gender, migration status, etc., often increase during times of economic and social hardship. And his question in particular is asking the panelists what sort of peace-building mechanisms and tools will be needed to enhance social cohesion under the impact of COVID-19 and the legacies of COVID-19, and I guess in the social, economic and political sphere. So he's asking what peace-building mechanisms are required and who needs to be at the table in discussing these, setting up these mechanisms for reducing or increasing, social cohesion. So who would like to take on that response?
I'll go with maybe a contrary response. I think in comparison to maybe some of the other countries in the region, the Bahamas has not had much social outrest and outrage at inequality. So some of the social tensions that Yonique was mentioning with different class and income, we've experienced that with COVID here. There's been very much this comment from the state that the Bahamian is the one that's causing COVID to be rapidly transmitted. And so we need all of these, lockdowns and the inner city, and those are the ones that are causing the spread. And there's been this, there's a lot of talk about lower class Bahamians being blamed for COVID and being treated differently. We've had, people arrested for going out to get water from the public water pump during a quarantine, even though this is the only access to water that they've had. We've had street vendors, in the informal economy. This is how they make their money, and they're being arrested. Meanwhile, higher income persons are able to have weddings because they know the prime minister to get exemption for that. So there's a lot of talk about a different approach for different groups of people, but there hasn't been any social unrest to try to come up with how this changes. So in the Bahamian context, I think we don't need peace building. I think we actually need more outrage and unrest in order to get the government to actually pay attention to this and to see that there needs to be some systemic changes in how we deal with people from different social economic backgrounds.
Thank you. I guess Kevon and Yonique also mentioned their experience in Jamaica and responses there. And I wonder, Kevon, you were talking about the digital divide, if you will, most noticeable amongst lower income and higher income, especially children in Jamaica. And I don't know whether if you want to comment on that and that post-COVID impact on those inequalities. And I guess Yonique as well, your recent interviews and research, again, you mentioned that the notion we're all in it together, but we're not really all in it together. And also Stacy-ann, I guess you talked about transformation and whether that comes from actually shouting out against and breaking down that sort of framework of resilience and sort of change the socioeconomic system. So I don't know whether you have any comments, either any of you, on that.
Right, I could have a comment, if you don't mind, Kevon and Yonique. Not my area of specialization at all, but one thing that has been resting with me, and we probably didn't have an opportunity to go into great detail about today, is just the role of culture and celebration. And if we are to look at, for example, Jamaica, by all intents and purposes, Jamaica was doing really well in the earlier part of the year in terms of managing just the number of cases of COVID. But then we went into a kind of celebration mode where we had the emancipation and independence holidays. So how we come together as a Caribbean people and how that is just a direct affront to our ability to manage COVID. And in Jamaica, shortly after Emancipendence, as we call it, there was a general election, and in the Caribbean, another reason to get together and celebrate. So one of the things that I want to put forward is just the importance of understanding the culture in the region, integrate some cultural considerations into any recovery plan that we might develop.
Thank you very much. We'll have a question from Johannes, and also ties in a question or comment from Elizabeth. Johannes writes that we can see from around the world, much of the responses to COVID have been on a nation-state basis, as individual countries enacting their own sort of lockdown or their own policy. And he said that's in contrast to many of the climate action we see that does rely on regional, global agreements and action, collective action. Johannes asks, do the panelists observe the same tendencies in the Caribbean, i.e. To go purely nation state or state-led reaction? And if so, will the COVID-19 responses remain on a national scale going forward? And I think also Elizabeth asks about, there's been little comments, not in this panel, but overall, about the role of CARICOM and the role of the single market economy in the Caribbean in terms of their response to COVID. So I'll throw it open to the discussants about that, the response, state-led or regionally led response to COVID.
Maybe I could respond to that briefly. I think there's a similar trend in the Caribbean. Definitely the government, the state has taken the lead really in kind of organizing the recovery efforts. And we've seen the kind of, rise of nationalism again. I mean, examples like lockdowns. I know Barbados have a high risk list of countries that they have kind of signaled won't necessarily be allowing those persons from those countries to enter their domestic space. And I think going forward, I think that's still going to be the trend, right? Thinking about the vaccination program that's going to be rolling out over the next couple of months, that's going to be done again by the state. And what that's doing is kind of creating very interesting state society subjectivities and dynamics. I think part of it is linked to what we saw in the initial stages of COVID. Many of the responses that governments in the Caribbean did was in response to what they saw happening in Italy, that they saw happening across Western Europe and United States. And the policies that were taken in terms of locking down borders and putting in these strict measures were also kind of based off them kind of observing what was going on in countries like the US, Canada, and Western Europe. And I think going forward, that's probably not going to change. The state is still going to play a very central role in that, moving forward.
Thank you. Does another panelist want to, Yonique, I think, is that?
Yeah, I'm struggling a bit to hear. I don't know why. But I believe largely you're seeing a sort of national or nationalistic response, but I do believe there have been some regional responses, around the economy, food security, and so on. And I think Mia Motley had initiated a conversation about taking a collective approach There's also a COVID-19 task force out of the University of the West Indies, and the university is really a regional institution. So that might also be taken as one instance of a regional approach to COVID-19. I know an article was also written about these sorts of regional mechanisms as well. And really kind of looking at the context and the challenges going forward. But I think we're seeing a bit of a mixed response. But I think by and large, perhaps the response has been more national in some respects than regional. But the regional bodies and the international bodies tend to approach the international groups. And well, yes, PAHO, also WHO, I think they prefer to kind of take on, you know, regional bodies as opposed to national government. So I think, you know, the importance of aid and assistance from these international bodies, I think, you know, also ensures to some degree that there is some, you know, working together across the region. And I think the leadership at the CARICOM level is also keen to have, you know, cooperation going forward. I think we have to wait to see what will happen in the kind of post-COVID dispensation, if it would really strengthen the way the Caribbean really addresses important challenges.
Thank you very much. I have a question from Colin Clark, referring, I think, to I think Yonique's comment about Buju Banton. But Colin writes, in the UK, we started with COVID-19 in March and then arrived at Black Lives Matter in June. And he's asking about, there's a clear shift. It's been a tumultuous year, but what were the implications for that overlap of the COVID-19 impact, and then there's the Black Lives Matter and the impacts, the shockwaves, if you will, across the Caribbean?
Yeah, good afternoon, Colin. I'm very pleased to hear that my former supervisor is here as well. The Black Lives Matter, I think, was quite significant in the US. I think that is perhaps where we really saw an impact, but because again of the sort of influence of US politics and so on the Caribbean, there was also a conversation taking place in the Caribbean, of course, as well around race. You know, this is a very important issue, and the society does not necessarily agree on some of these colonial and post-colonial legacies and what they mean and so on for the Caribbean. But certainly the video from Buju Banton on the interview really spoke to some of those kinds of, you know, racial issues and the oppression of a certain race in Jamaica and so on. And during the pandemic, there's also a court case concerning a child who was banned from school because of wearing dreadlocks. So that was happening in a kind of at the same time that those protests were happening in Jamaica. We also was dealing with our own sorts of issues, but I don't know if we've used race to frame in the way that we see it in the US, if we've really used race to frame the discussions around COVID-19 and the responses around COVID-19. I think we see that played out more in the context of the US because of what was happening there. I hope that is helpful and I'm not just rambling away.
Thank you very much, Yonique. We promised, though, we'll keep it 60 minutes, and it's always good to leave an audience wanting more. So I'd like to thank all our panelists, Kevon, Stacy-ann, Adele and Yonique, for a stimulating discussion. I thank the audience for the questions coming in, but a couple of remaining questions about economic integration. But I see Kevin's been multitasking and answered Elizabeth and to some extent Shelley's questions. So thank you all for joining us today. I'd like to thank the Centre for Research on Humanities in Oxford, who are hosting and sponsoring this 2-year and hopefully more years of Caribbean Studies Network seminars. These are online for the moment. There are 12 a year. Do join us if you can next time, and we look forward to seeing you, some of you or maybe all of you, again online when we resume our Caribbean Studies Network out of Oxford University in January. So thank you very much indeed. A pleasure being listening and watching you all and engaging with your questions. So thank you very much indeed, and goodbye.
Thank you, David. Thank you to the
Bye-bye.
audience.
All right, take care, guys.
Bye.
Yes.